What if one country, perched at the edge of the known world, quietly became the hinge upon which all of European power turned, not through brute conquest alone, but through marriage, diplomacy, religion, and the sheer weight of its imperial reach? Spain's story is not merely the story of conquistadors and galleons. It is the story of a kingdom that mastered the art of survival, alliance, and influence across 5 centuries, reshaping European borders, mediating its greatest conflicts, and refusing to disappear even when the empires it built crumbled to dust. From the Catholic monarchs who married their children into every royal house of Europe, to the modern democracy that anchors NATO's southern flank and bridges the Atlantic world, Spain has always been more than it appears. And the world has often failed to notice until it was too late. The foundation of Spanish diplomatic power, the Catholic monarchs, and the marriage web of Europe, 1469 to 1516. To understand Spain's diplomatic importance in Europe, one must begin not on a battlefield, but in a bedchamber, or rather, in the careful, calculated negotiations that surrounded royal marriages in the late 15th century. When Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon wed in 1469, they did not simply unite two powerful Iberian kingdoms. They created the template for a diplomatic strategy that would define Spanish foreign policy for the next 2 centuries: the use of dynastic marriage as the most sophisticated weapon in the arsenal of statecraft. Isabella and Ferdinand, known to history as the Catholic monarchs, a title granted by Pope Alexander VI in 1494, inherited fragmented, war-torn realms. Castile had endured bitter civil wars. Aragon was entangled in Mediterranean rivalries with France and the Italian city-states. Yet from the beginning, both monarchs understood that their survival and their ambitions depended not simply on military force, but on the construction of a web of alliances so dense, so carefully woven, that no European power could move without tugging its threads. Their first great diplomatic triumph was the negotiation of the Treaty of Medina del Campo in 1489, an alliance with England directed squarely against France. But this was only the beginning. Isabella and Ferdinand systematically arranged marriages for their children across the royal houses of Europe with a precision that modern historians have compared to corporate merger strategy. Their eldest daughter, Isabella, was married to Alfonso of Portugal, and upon his death, to his cousin Manuel, binding the Iberian Peninsula in a dynastic union that would bear enormous consequences for the next century. Their son Juan was wed to Margaret of Austria, daughter of Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I, inserting the Spanish crown directly into the Habsburg family network. Their daughter Joanna, the ill-fated Joanna who would later be known as La Loca, the Mad, was married to Philip the Handsome, son of Maximilian, a match that would ultimately bring the entire Habsburg inheritance into Spanish hands. And finally, their youngest daughter, Catherine, was dispatched to England to marry Arthur, Prince of Wales, and upon his death, she married his younger brother Henry, becoming Catherine of Aragon, the first wife of Henry VIII, whose refusal to grant her a divorce would trigger the English Reformation. This was diplomacy as grand architecture. Every marriage was a structural beam, designed not merely to forge a temporary friendship, but to create interlocking obligations, shared dynastic interests, and corridors of influence that spanned the continent. The Catholic monarchs were not simply rulers of Spain. They were the architects of a new European order, one in which Spanish royal blood flowed through the veins of the continent's most powerful dynasties. But marriage was only one instrument. Isabella and Ferdinand also pioneered the use of resident ambassadors, permanent diplomatic representatives stationed in foreign courts, at a time when most European monarchs still relied on occasional envoys dispatched for specific missions. The Spanish ambassador became a fixture of European court life. A trained professional, fluent in the language of the host country, cultivating relationships, gathering intelligence, and representing Spanish interests with a consistency and sophistication that other powers scrambled to imitate. By the early 16th century, Spain had established resident embassies in Rome, Venice, London, Lisbon, and the courts of the Holy Roman Empire, a diplomatic infrastructure unprecedented in its reach and permanence. The conquest of Granada in 1492, the final act in the centuries-long Reconquista, gave the Catholic monarchs another powerful diplomatic tool: religious prestige. The expulsion of the Moors from the Iberian Peninsula cast Ferdinand and Isabella as the champions of Christendom, defenders of the faith against the Muslim world. This reputation was enormously valuable in negotiations with the papacy and with other European Catholic powers, giving Spain a moral authority that translated directly into political leverage. When Columbus returned from a New World that same year, the diplomatic implications were staggering. The Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494, negotiated between Spain and Portugal under papal arbitration, divided the non-European world between the two Iberian powers, an act of breathtaking diplomatic ambition that treated the entire globe as a resource to be allocated by European agreement. Ferdinand proved particularly adept at what we might today call realpolitik, the cold, unsentimental manipulation of alliances for maximum advantage. His negotiations over the Kingdom of Naples, which he wrested from French control through a combination of military force and cunning diplomacy in 1503 to 1504, demonstrated his mastery of the art. He formed alliances with France when convenient, broke them when expedient, and always kept his ultimate strategic goals: the security of Aragonese Mediterranean interests and the construction of a barrier against French expansion, firmly in view. The Italian historian Niccolò Machiavelli, who observed Ferdinand's methods with something between admiration and alarm, used him as a model for the calculating, pragmatic prince described in his famous treatise. There is no higher testament to Ferdinand's diplomatic genius than being the inspiration for the prince. By the time Ferdinand died in 1516, Spain had been transformed. It was no longer a collection of quarreling Iberian kingdoms struggling for survival. It was the center of gravity of a new European order, wealthy beyond imagination from New World silver, militarily dominant through its tercios, the feared Spanish infantry regiments that would remain the finest in Europe for over a century, diplomatically connected to every major power through kinship and alliance, and possessed of a religious prestige that gave its monarchs unique leverage in dealings with Rome. The stage was set for the reign of Charles I of Spain, who would become Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, and the age of Spanish hegemony over European affairs. The foundation that Isabella and Ferdinand built was not simply an empire of territory. It was an empire of relationships, and in the volatile, treacherous world of European politics, relationships were the only currency that truly held its value across generations. The age of hegemony, Charles V, Philip II, and the weight of empire, 1516 to 1598. No figure in European history inherited more, governed more, or exhausted himself more completely in the service of diplomatic and military ambition than Charles of Habsburg, who became Charles I of Spain in 1516 and Holy Roman Emperor Charles V in 1519. At the age of 19, he was simultaneously King of Spain, King of Naples and Sicily, Duke of Burgundy and the Low Countries, Archduke of Austria, and lord of the vast and growing Spanish Empire in the Americas. He was quite literally the most powerful man in the world, and he spent his entire reign trying to hold that world together through a combination of warfare, negotiation, and sheer personal will. Charles's reign defined what Spanish diplomatic importance truly meant at its zenith. The Habsburg Empire he controlled was not a monolithic state, but a vast, multi-ethnic, multilingual constellation of territories held together by dynastic loyalty, shared Catholicism, and the constant, grinding work of diplomacy. Every corner of Europe was a potential crisis. France under Francis I, and later Henry II, was the perpetual rival, encircling Habsburg territories from the west and south, pressing into Italy, and periodically allying with the Ottoman Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent in what contemporaries regarded as a scandalous, almost sacrilegious partnership between a Christian king and the greatest Muslim power on earth. The Ottoman Empire itself threatened not merely the Mediterranean, but the very heart of Europe. Vienna was besieged in 1529. The Protestant Reformation, which erupted in Germany in 1517, just as Charles was consolidating his power, threatened to shatter the religious unity of Christendom that was the ideological foundation of Habsburg legitimacy. Charles responded to each crisis with a diplomatic flexibility that belied the rigidity sometimes attributed to him. He negotiated the Peace of Madrid with Francis I in 1526, only to watch France immediately repudiate it. He assembled the League of Cognac against the French, then faced the catastrophe of the sack of Rome in 1527, when his own mutinous troops ransacked the Eternal City, devastating his relationship with the papacy at the worst possible moment. He negotiated the Peace of Cambrai in 1529, temporarily stabilizing the French front. He convened the Diet of Augsburg in 1530, attempting to find a theological compromise with the Lutherans that would prevent the fragmentation of the empire. When that failed, he continued to search for solutions, eventually recognizing the pragmatic necessity of the Peace of Augsburg in 1555, which established the principle of cuius regio, ius religio. The ruler of each German territory would determine its official religion. This was a profound diplomatic concession, but also a pragmatic recognition of reality. Charles's relationship with England illustrates the complexity of Spanish diplomacy in this period. His aunt was Catherine of Aragon, Henry VIII queen. When Henry sought an annulment of that marriage, Charles was placed in an impossible position. He could not allow the humiliation of his aunt without losing prestige and honor. Yet antagonizing the most powerful monarch in Northern Europe carried serious risks. Charles essentially blocked the papal annulment through his influence over Pope Clement VII, who was at that point largely his prisoner following the sack of Rome. This diplomatic pressure contributed directly to Henry's decision to break with Rome and establish the Church of England, meaning that Spain's dynastic politics were a proximate cause of the English Reformation. The ripple effects of this single diplomatic confrontation would shape European religious and political life for centuries. Philip II, who inherited the Spanish crown from his exhausted father in 1556, Charles abdicated and retired to a monastery, a gesture of profound symbolic resignation, represented a different but equally consequential diplomatic style. Where Charles had been peripatetic, constantly moving between his territories, personally present at negotiations and battlefields, Philip was a bureaucrat king who governed from his desk in El Escorial, the vast palace monastery he built in the mountains north of Madrid. Philip read every document, annotated every report, and controlled the most complex administrative machinery in the world through the sheer force of his personal attention to detail. His diplomatic correspondence ran to millions of documents. Philip's diplomatic priorities were clear: the defense of Catholicism, the suppression of heresy, particularly in the Netherlands, where Calvinist revolt was tearing apart one of the wealthiest and most strategically vital regions of his empire, and the maintenance of Spanish dominance in the Mediterranean against the Ottoman threat. The Battle of Lepanto in 1571, where the combined Christian fleet organized under Spanish leadership decisively defeated the Ottoman navy, was the greatest triumph of his reign, a military victory with enormous diplomatic implications, demonstrating that the Ottoman advance into the Western Mediterranean could be halted and establishing Spain as the indispensable protector of Catholic Christendom. Yet Philip also demonstrated the limits of diplomatic power when it was driven by ideological rigidity. His decision to send the Armada against England in 1588, partly a military enterprise, partly a crusade to restore Catholicism to a Protestant nation, ended in catastrophic failure, costing Spain irreplaceable ships, experienced sailors, and international prestige. The revolt of the Netherlands, which he spent his entire reign attempting to suppress through a combination of military force and diplomatic isolation of the rebels, ultimately proved beyond his ability to resolve. The Dutch Republic that emerged from that struggle would become Spain's most dangerous commercial rival in the 17th century. Philip's Spain was simultaneously the most powerful and most overstretched state in Europe, the first true superpower bearing all of a superpower's burdens. Its silver funded European banking. Its armies garrisoned Italy, the Netherlands, and the Caribbean. Its diplomats negotiated in every European capital. But the weight of empire was beginning to tell, and the seeds of eventual decline were already germinating in the soil of overcommitment and fiscal strain. Decline, resilience, and reinvention. Spain between the Peace of Westphalia and the Bourbon reforms, 1648 to 1788. When the 30 Years' War finally ground to its exhausted conclusion in 1648, and the delegates assembled in the German cities of Osnabrück and Münster signed the Peace of Westphalia, the new map of Europe revealed something that would have been unthinkable a century before. Spain was no longer the dominant power on the continent. The France of Cardinal Richelieu and then of Louis XIV had taken that crown. The Dutch Republic, which Spain had spent 80 years trying to suppress, was now recognized as a fully sovereign state and a major commercial empire. The Holy Roman Empire was permanently fragmented. The age of Spanish hegemony was over. Yet to describe what followed as simple decline is to miss something essential about Spanish diplomacy in the late 17th and 18th centuries. Spain remained a major power, weakened, yes, overstretched, certainly battered by military defeats and fiscal crises, but still in possession of the largest overseas empire in the world, still a significant military force, and still capable of diplomatic influence that far exceeded what its diminishing resources might have warranted. Spanish diplomats learned, out of painful necessity, the art of operating from a position of relative weakness, an art that would serve their successors well in the modern era. The War of Spanish Succession, 1701 to 1714, was the definitive crisis of this transition. When the last Spanish Habsburg, Charles II, physically and mentally debilitated, without an heir, died in 1700, his will bequeath the entire Spanish Empire to Philip of Anjou, grandson of Louis XIV of France. The prospect of the Spanish and French crowns united under Bourbon rule, and therefore the entire Spanish Empire aligned with French power, was unacceptable to the other major European states. The resulting war lasted 13 years, engulfed most of Europe, stretched across oceans to the Americas and Asia, and ultimately produced a compromise settlement at the Treaties of Utrecht, 1713, and Rastatt, 1714, that shaped European politics for generations. Spain emerged from this catastrophe transformed, but not destroyed. Philip V was recognized as King of Spain, but the Spanish Netherlands and Spanish Italy were transferred to Austria, and Gibraltar and Minorca were ceded to Britain, territorial losses of enormous strategic significance. Yet the diplomatic achievement was considerable. Spain had preserved its American empire intact, had secured Bourbon succession, and had avoided the complete dismemberment that some of its enemies had sought. The new Bourbon monarchy brought with it French administrative methods and French diplomatic connections, advantages that, over time, would be used to reconstruct Spanish power on a more rational and sustainable basis. The family compacts, three successive treaties between the Bourbon monarchies of France and Spain, signed in 1733, 1743, and 1761, represented the most sustained attempt in Spanish diplomatic history to use alliance politics to compensate for military weakness. By aligning permanently with France against Britain, Spain was effectively choosing sides in the great global struggle between French and British power that dominated the 18th century. The strategy had mixed results. The War of Austrian Succession, 1740 to 1748, and the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, brought Spain into conflicts that exceeded its capacity to sustain, and the 7 Years' War in particular ended disastrously. Spain lost Florida to Britain and gained Louisiana from France, but found itself humiliated by the ease with which British forces had captured Havana and Manila. Yet, even in defeat, Spain demonstrated a diplomatic resilience that commands attention. The Treaty of Paris in 1763 restored Havana and Manila in exchange for Florida, a trade that, while painful, preserved the core of the American empire. And the lesson was not lost on Spanish policymakers. The great reforming ministers of the late 18th century, men like the Marquis of Esquelake and above all José Menino, Count of Floridablanca, understood that Spain's diplomatic position depended ultimately on the strength of its internal economy and administrative efficiency. The Bourbon reforms of the 1760s through 1790s, administrative reorganization, economic liberalization, military modernization, and the restructuring of colonial trade, were as much a diplomatic project as a domestic one, designed to rebuild the foundations of Spanish power that the wars of the previous century had eroded. Spain's revenge came in the American Revolutionary War. When the 13 American colonies rose against Britain in 1776, Spain watched with keen strategic interest. In 1779, under the leadership of Floridablanca and King Charles III, Spain entered the war against Britain, not as an open ally of the American rebels, whose example of colonial revolution was not one Madrid wished to encourage in its own American empire, but as a co-belligerent pursuing its own strategic objectives, the recovery of Gibraltar, Minorca, and Florida. The results were mixed. Gibraltar held out despite a famous siege, but Minorca was recovered and Florida was retaken. More importantly, Spain had demonstrated that it remained a significant military and diplomatic actor capable of influencing the outcome of a world war, a demonstration that carried enormous value in the currency of European prestige. The late 18th century saw Spain also playing a significant role in the emergence of a new kind of European diplomacy, the diplomacy of international law and neutral rights. Floridablanca was a driving force behind the League of Armed Neutrality, 1780, a coalition of maritime powers that challenged Britain's aggressive enforcement of naval blockade rights. This was Spain operating as a champion of international legal norms against the abuse of sea power, a role that anticipated the kind of multilateral, rule-based diplomacy that would become central to European international relations in the 19th and 20th centuries. Spain entered the revolutionary era exhausted, but not broken. Its diplomatic tradition, forged over 3 centuries of managing empire, alliance, and rivalry, remained sophisticated and adaptable. The catastrophes of the Napoleonic Wars would test that tradition to its absolute limits. But the foundations laid by the Bourbon reformers would prove, in the long run, more durable than anyone in 1789 could have imagined. Modern Spain, from isolation to integration, and the new diplomatic weight of a democratic power, 1898, present. The year 1898 is seared into Spanish memory as the Annus Horribilis, the year of the disaster. Defeated by the United States in the Spanish-American War, Spain lost Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines in a matter of months. The last great remnants of the overseas empire that had defined Spanish identity and sustained Spanish power for 4 centuries were gone. A nation that had once dispatched ambassadors to the courts of every European monarch, that had funded the art of Velázquez and the philosophy of Suarez on the silver of American minds, now faced an existential question. What was Spain without its empire? What role could it play in a Europe that had moved on, in a world where the great powers were now Britain, France, Germany, Russia, and the rising giant of the United States? The answer, worked out painfully over the following century, would prove more consequential and more impressive than anyone in 1898 could have predicted. Spain's first diplomatic choice in the new century was, in retrospect, one of remarkable strategic wisdom: neutrality in the First World War. While Britain, France, Germany, Russia, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire tore each other apart between 1914 and 1918, Spain remained outside the conflict. King Alfonso XIII used this neutrality actively, organizing humanitarian missions, facilitating prisoner exchanges, and acting as an intermediary between the belligerent powers, a role that won Spain significant goodwill and, crucially, economic benefit from supplying all sides. Spain emerged from a war with its treasury strengthened and its international reputation enhanced, while its neighbors lay exhausted and bled white. The catastrophe of the Spanish Civil War, 1936 to 1939, and the subsequent Franco dictatorship interrupted this trajectory for nearly 4 decades. Francisco Franco's regime was a diplomatic embarrassment for democratic Europe. Fascist in origin, authoritarian in practice, isolated by its association with Hitler and Mussolini, excluded from the United Nations at its founding, and subject to an international boycott that lasted until the early 1950s. Yet even here, Spanish diplomatic tradition showed its adaptability. Franco navigated the Second World War with the same instinct for neutrality that had served Alfonso XIII, declining Hitler's pressure to enter the conflict despite the ideological affinities and the tempting offer of Gibraltar. His private conversations with Hitler at Hendaye in 1940, in which he made demands that the German dictator found impossibly extravagant, became legendary as a masterclass in diplomatic stalling. Whether this was calculated genius or fortunate stubbornness has been debated by historians ever since, but the outcome was unambiguous. Spain survived the war intact, and Franco's regime, however distasteful to the democracies, was preserved. The Cold War gave Spain a new diplomatic card to play. Franco's fierce anti-communism made him, in the eyes of Washington, a useful, if uncomfortable ally. The Pact of Madrid in 1953, an executive agreement between Spain and the United States that gave American forces access to Spanish military bases in exchange for economic aid and military equipment, ended Spain's international isolation and inserted it back into the Western strategic architecture. It was a Faustian bargain of sorts, legitimizing a dictatorship in exchange for strategic geography, but it was also a demonstration of Spain's enduring geopolitical value. Its position controlling the western entrance to the Mediterranean, flanking the Atlantic approaches to Europe, made it indispensable to any serious Western defense strategy. The transformation that followed Franco's death in 1975 was one of the most remarkable diplomatic achievements of the 20th century. The transition to democracy, the transition, was not simply a domestic political process. It was a sophisticated diplomatic exercise negotiated simultaneously with domestic political actors, with the European community, with NATO, with the United States, and with Latin America. King Juan Carlos I, who had been expected by many to perpetuate authoritarianism, instead became the champion of democratic reform, famously intervening personally to defeat an attempted military coup on February 23, 1981, an act of political courage that cemented Spain's democratic credentials in the eyes of the world. Spain joined NATO in 1982, the European Community in 1986, and the Schengen area in 1995. Each accession was a diplomatic milestone, but they also represented something deeper: the reintegration of Spain into the institutional architecture of democratic Europe after nearly half a century of exclusion. And Spain brought to these institutions not merely its territory and its population, but its unique geopolitical assets and its historical relationships, particularly its connections to Latin America. The Spanish-speaking world, the Hispanosphere, comprising 20 countries across 2 continents with a combined population of over 500 million people, constitutes Spain's most distinctive and most valuable diplomatic asset in the contemporary world. No other European power possesses anything comparable: a network of linguistic, cultural, historical, and family ties to an entire hemisphere. Spain has institutionalized this relationship through the Ibero-American summits, held annually since 1991, through the Cervantes Institute, which promotes the Spanish language and culture worldwide, and through its consistent advocacy for Latin American interests within European Union councils. When the EU negotiates trade agreements with Mercosur or CARICOM, Spain's voice is amplified by its relationships in ways that Germany or France cannot replicate. In the 21st century, Spain has played a role in European and global diplomacy that considerably exceeds what its economic size alone would predict. Its membership in NATO, the EU, the UN Security Council, as a non-permanent member on multiple occasions, and the G20 gives it platforms for influence. Its geographic position, controlling sea lanes between the Atlantic and Mediterranean, sharing a border with Morocco across the Strait of Gibraltar, managing the EU's most complex migration frontier, makes it a pivotal actor in European security policy. The Ceuta and Melilla enclaves on the North African coast represent both a vulnerability and a strategic asset, giving Spain a unique perspective on African affairs that few European nations can claim. Spain has also emerged as a significant contributor to international peacekeeping and crisis management operations. Spanish forces have served in Bosnia, Kosovo, Afghanistan, Lebanon, Mali, and the Central African Republic. The country has developed particular expertise in post-conflict stabilization and civil-military cooperation that has made it a valued partner in NATO operations. And Spain's consistent advocacy for multilateralism, international law, and dialogue in resolving conflicts, rooted in its own traumatic experience of civil war and its subsequent democratic transition, gives its voice a particular moral authority in international forums. As Europe navigates the challenges of the 2020s, the aftermath of Brexit, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the rise of China, the management of migration from Africa and the Middle East, and the deepening integration of the European Union, Spain stands at an intersection of pressures and opportunities that makes its diplomacy more consequential than at any time since the age of the Habsburgs. It bridges Europe and Latin America. It mediates between the northern and southern flanks of NATO. It manages Europe's most sensitive border with the African continent. And it brings to all of these challenges a diplomatic tradition of extraordinary depth and resilience. 5 centuries of experience in surviving catastrophe, adapting to changing circumstances, and finding again and again a way to matter.